From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming to our Books and Beyond program today. My name is Guy Lamolinar, and I'm with the Center for the Book. And for those of you who don't know much about us, we're a small office in the library, and one of the things that we do is we organize these Books and Beyond author programs. And another thing we do is we work on the National Book Festival, which this year will be September 21st and 22nd. And I encourage you to come to that. It's a wonderful way to meet authors and to get your books signed there. And there are more than 200,000 people who come to it every summer. It's a really wonderful event. Another thing that the Center for the Book does is we promote books, reading, libraries, and literacy, not just here in Washington, but throughout the nation. And the way we do that is we have a state center in every state. We have one here in the District of Columbia, and we even have one in the U.S. Virgin Islands. We also have a partnership with about 80 like-minded organizations that promote books and reading and literacy just as we do. And if you want to learn more about us, you can go to read.gov on the Library of Congress website. Before we get started, I just want to ask you to please turn off your electronic devices. And I need to tell you that we're recording this today for later webcasting. So if you ask a question, you'll become a part of that webcast. And all our webcasts are available on read.gov, and there are more than 200 author discussions there. So if you see a discussion that you're not able to attend here at the library, eventually you'll see it on read.gov. Today's author's book is going to be for sale outside this room here, and he'll be signing the book, and that will be another chance for you to ask questions about him, or to him, excuse me. Sometimes we're asked how we get these authors to do these Books and Beyond programs, and the major criterion that we have for that is that the author must have written a book based on the collections of the Library of Congress. And today's book is on Senator Moynihan, who of course has his papers here at the Library of Congress, and we're very lucky to have his daughter here with us today. And it's now my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Gil Troy. Gil Troy is a professor of history at McGill University and a research fellow at the Shalom Hartman Institute's Engaging Israel program. His many articles have appeared in the New York Times, the New Republic, the Jerusalem Post, Open Zion, and many other media outlets. Gil Troy is also the author of 8 books, including Why Moderates Make the Best Presidents. Please join me in welcoming Gil Troy. Thank you.
Thank you, Guy. Thank all of you for coming. It's really a pleasure to come to this temple of learning. About 20 years ago, as a young graduate student, I came here and spent 6 months in the Madison building looking at the papers of many presidential candidates for my dissertation, which became my first book, See How They Ran. And there's a rhythm to the Library of Congress, and there's a beauty and a power to the Library of Congress. This is a city of monuments. But this monument, which is about words and ideas, is my particular favorite. And it's a particular honor to talk about the Moynihan Papers because the Moynihan collection is really one of the jewels in the crown of this extraordinary place. And you'll see, by the way, the little sleight of hand I was able to do with the photographs of the Library of Congress. This is the photograph that we found of Moynihan, and unlike many of the photographs that you get from Corbis and elsewhere, it was free, or $15, I think. So we turned it into the book cover, giving that Moynihan-esque power. And if you look at these numbers, these are the numbers that tell a little bit of the story of the Daniel Patrick Moynihan collection at the Library of Congress. Over 1,300,000 items. And to just put it in context, this isn't a Letterman list, but these are the top 5 collections in the Library of Congress, and it's the second largest. And I was extremely fortunate in that, unlike the research project I took upon myself 28 years ago when I was trying to tell the whole story of presidential campaigning, so I had to cover over 200 years of campaigning. This, I focused on one particular year. So with this extraordinary collection, I was able to zero in on 1975. And thanks very much to Maura Moynihan, whom I also want to greet, who had taken on this extraordinary project of putting together her father's letters, which were edited by Steve Weissman. And I know authors are only supposed to promote their own books, but I would also like to urge you to get her book. It allowed me to do the primary research on the 1975 period and then take marvelous, amazing quotations, some of which I'll share with you today, from that book. So thank you, Maura. You're a co-star today. In order to tell the story of Moynihan's moment, we have to go back to the 1970s and to perhaps one of the lowest moments in American history, April 30th, 1975, when Saigon fell. And the 70s in general were a difficult decade. They were a decade of soaring crime, of inflation, of unemployment, of oil embargoes. It was the decade when Richard Nixon became the first American president to resign, and he was then replaced by Gerald Ford, if anybody remembers him. And the period of the 1970s was so bleak, and growing up in New York in the 1970s was particularly bleak, that we kind of, it's hard to remember just how much Americans felt like they had lost a certain edge. They had lost a certain faith in themselves. I hate modern television shows, so I don't like my kids to watch anything after the 1970s or 80s, so I sometimes show them Kojak. And you may recall, those of you old enough to have seen the original, that basically there was this one loud ethnic hero, in this case Greek, standing between disorder and civility. And on the television screens it was Kojak, but today I want to talk about another one, an Irish Catholic hero, Daniel Patrick Moynihan. 6 months after the fall of South Vietnam, this idea starts making its way through the United Nations that in this forum of nationalisms, one form of nationalism, Jewish nationalism, Zionism, is racism. And Moynihan is relatively new to the job as UN ambassador. And he comes in and he starts working with the Israeli ambassador, Chaim Hertzog. And Moynihan's moment is really November 10th, 1975. But we have to go back 3 weeks before that, because the UN, following its procedures, has a discussion, a debate, goes to committee. And in the third committee, the Human Rights Committee, the idea that Zionism is racism was first promulgated, and they had to have a vote in mid-October. And Chaim Hertzog gets up that day and gives a speech saying, Jewish people aren't on trial. The UN is on trial today. Will the UN stand by its defining ideals? Will the UN be the kind of place that is committed to the specificity of ideas and of concepts, or just politicizing human rights? And a second person spoke that day against the resolution, Leonard Garment. Leonard Garment was an old Nixon hand, a friend of Nixon's from the days when Nixon was in political exile in New York in a law firm. And he'd worked in the Nixon White House, and now he was serving as the U.S. ambassador to the Human Rights Committee, to this third committee. Garment was a trial lawyer, and he said he spent hours trying to figure out what was the right word to use in describing that resolution. And he came upon the word obscene. And he calls it an obscene act. And obscenity, of course, sullies us all. It diminishes us all. But the inevitable happens. Hertzog gives his speech, Garment gives his speech, and the third committee passes the resolution, passing it on to the General Assembly, which will debate it in November. Moynihan had been quiet that day. The delegates, after the vote, break out in mock applause, mocking the UN, mocking Israel, mocking the Jewish people. Hertzog had given his delegation strict instructions not to react. We're representing the dignity of the state of Israel. Don't show them any emotion. Don't give them any satisfaction. But from across the room, a 6'5", garrulous Harvard man who'd grown up in Hell's Kitchen, in the streets of New York, made his way all the way to being a professor in government and sociology and education at Harvard, who had served in the Kennedy administration, the Johnson administration, Nixon administration, now in the Ford administration, stands up, straightens his tie, walks across the room, hugs Chaim Hertzog, and really loudly says, that's an exact quotation in the papers. Now, of course, the New York Times would render it as he gave Hertzog an embrace. And in later years, when Moynihan would tell the story, he would say, I uttered an Anglo-Saxonism not found in the Talmud. But what he was saying that day was two things. One is he was saying to Chaim Hertzog, you're not alone. But more than that, he was saying this is a new style of diplomacy. And he'd be accused of being undiplomatic. And he'd say, but sometimes passion is the thing that needs to be brought ahead. Now, when Moynihan did that, he was feeling very alone. Part of the reason why he was feeling so alone was because the New York Times was warning him not to be so undiplomatic, not to be so confrontational. And as a good New York intellectual, he lived and died by where he was in position in the New York Times and whether the New York Times loved him or hated him that particular day. His own boss, Henry Kissinger, the Secretary of State, who did, of course, oppose the resolution, also opposed Moynihan's approach. And in this picture, which was given to me as a gift by Maura when we first met, you see Moynihan sitting on a couch with Henry Kissinger, and in the middle is Kurt Waldheim. Kurt Waldheim, of course, was Secretary General of the UN. At the time, there were rumors, it was only confirmed later, that he had been a Nazi. And here you have Henry Kissinger, who had lost 19 relatives in the Holocaust, in open, expansive dialogue with Kurt Waldheim, and Daniel Patrick Moynihan looks like he'd rather be anywhere else, just conveying his contempt. But he's feeling lonely, he's feeling alone, he's feeling abandoned. What do I do? In fact, he would even turn to Chaim Hertzog and say, where's the Jewish community? We're not hearing them. And Moynihan's connection to Israel was not very strong when he first came into the UN. He said that Israel was not his religion. In fact, as an academic, he kind of complained that he'd never gotten one of those cool free trips to Israel to bond him with the place. And he came into the UN with an agenda to bring pride back to the United States, an agenda to defend the Western democracies against totalitarianism, and an agenda also, of course, to restore his own reputation. It's, of course, 1975. This is after the trauma of the 1960s, and Daniel Patrick Moynihan had been very much traumatized by the 1960s. At Harvard, and working as a Harvard professor in the Nixon White House, you can imagine that didn't make him very popular, he sees the elites of the country, the best bred, the best educated, turning against America. And of course, Moynihan's a liberal, but he sees a fight emerging within liberalism itself. He says, how can we not pay for this if we forget the fundamentals of patriotism? And as an intellectual, as a social scientist, he also feels betrayed by his fellow intellectuals. Their needs are so abstract, he says, that the totalitarians can make them happy. And there are too many people who profess to love humanity, but forget to defend freedom and forget to love their fellow human beings. And of course, Moynihan had been traumatized back in 1965 when he was working for the Johnson administration by the Moynihan Report. The Moynihan Report was a sociological analysis which worried about the collapse of what he called at the time Negro family, the African American family. The illegitimacy rates that Moynihan was worried about in the 1960s are now much less than the illegitimacy rates for the white and black population in the United States of America. And the Brown University historian James Patterson has written a marvelous book, also using the Library of Congress papers, looking at the Moynihan Report that was deemed to be a racist report, even though what he was trying to do was raise an issue. Use, as a social scientist, his tools, the tools of research, the tools of analysis, and the tools of the gift of gab, to trigger a conversation about where is the American family going and where is, in particular, the black family structure going. But he felt deeply burned by those attacks. And in general, he's worried. He's worried that Americans are becoming too apologetic. He's worried that this kind of approach that is too self-critical and too hypercritical. And he says this is a society worth defending, which will be the slogan on which he'll run for the New York Senate in 1976. And he has two fights on the left. One is what he calls the totalitarian left, the far left, the radical left. But also people in the media, intellectuals, whom I call adversarials, part of the adversary culture, who are just instinctively critical of the United States and so self-critical that they're forgetting some of the core ideas. And in that eternal tension that liberals and conservatives struggle with between liberty and equality, Moynihan and his closest colleagues emphasize liberty because they fear, in the era where the Soviet Union is so ascendant, they fear in an era where communist China is becoming more and more powerful, that the obsession about equality often comes at the cost of liberty. But do not make the mistake that so many people did and call him a neoconservative. First of all, he hated the term. He said it was a term coined an epithet. And there's a letter that he writes to Punch Sulzberger of the New York Times saying, every time one of your reporters wants to call me a neoconservative, please just cross it out and write patriotic liberal or liberal who believes in the defense budget. And he also believes that culture counts. He believes, and that's why he got involved in this whole fight over the family structure in the United States. They have to look not just at politics, but also at culture. Look at what's going on behind the scenes. Look at what's going on in the families. Look at what's going on on television. But fundamentally, throughout his career, and it becomes completely clear during the Reagan administration when he fights Ronald Reagan tooth and nail over so many issues, especially domestically, he believes in the Democratic Party. He believes in Franklin Roosevelt's liberal ideals. And he says the great idea at the heart of the Democratic Party is that an elected government can be the instrument of the common purpose of a free people, that government can embrace great causes and do great things. And in the UN, 6 months after the fall of South Vietnam, in a corroding, chaotic New York, he wants to bring greatness back to the national conversation. He wants to bring greatness back to the national stage. But first he's dispatched from the Nixon White House to the embassy in India. And it's a difficult time for him. On the one hand, as the Watergate scandal grows and grows, he feels relieved that he's not swept up on it. He's also enough of a player and ambitious enough that he feels a little bit hurt that he wasn't important enough to be included by Haldeman and Ehrlichman in all their machinations. But as the Nixon scandal gets worse and worse, Moynihan, sitting in New Delhi, feels worse and worse too. He's feeling badly that he had actually supported Richard Nixon in 1972 and said to his fellow Democrats, this guy's okay. And he writes in this powerful letter to his good friend Nathan Glazer, have I been a fool or a whore or both? What do you call such a person? A Moynihan, I suppose. A term suggestive of moral and political failing. And here too I want to stop and say one of the powers of the great collection at the Library of Congress, the Moynihan collection and so many others, is it's there warts and all. It's not sanitized. This letter, showing where he's really quite critical of himself and quite despairing, is there, and it's also included in that marvelous collection of letters that I mentioned. And what's so extraordinary is that's May 1973. Short 2.5 years later, a Moynihan is not going to be a fool or a whore or both. It's going to be shorthand for a hero. But first, he finishes his tour in India, and he writes an article in Commentary magazine, The U.S. in Opposition. Having lived in India, having seen the changing dynamics in the third world, having seen a kind of automatic majority starting to establish itself in the United Nations, which is constantly voting against the United States, despite many of the countries getting American aid. Having seen the great apologetics emerging from American diplomacy and American diplomats, he writes this article, and he gets the highest compliment that Henry Kissinger could give him. Kissinger says, as he reads the article, I wish I had written that myself. And academics rarely say that about somebody else's work, especially Henry Kissinger. And what we're going to actually see is this monumental fight between Henry Kissinger and Daniel Patrick Moynihan, two Harvard egos, two men used to being the smartest person in the room, two individuals with very different worldviews and very different approaches to diplomacy. But this is still during the honeymoon period. The article is written, And Kissinger invites Moynihan to serve Gerald Ford as U.S. ambassador to the UN. And when Moynihan meets with Gerald Ford on the day he's sworn in, he says words hurt us. We have to be careful. We can't just say words don't count. We can't just say that the decisions passed in the UN General Assembly aren't significant. We have to take them seriously and we have to fight hard against them. And he keeps on emphasizing that he's not so concerned with the accused, but with the accusers. His obsession is what he calls these totalitarians who are standing up and turning the UN and its ideals on its head. He's offended when in November 1974, a year before this great fight, Yasser Arafat, the terrorist, comes and speaks to the United Nations. He's offended when Idi Amin, in October 1975, comes to the UN, and everyone rushes to greet the butcher of Uganda. Moynihan is invited, representing the United States, to the dinner that Kurt Waldheim is hosting for Idi Amin. And Moynihan had a tendency to sometimes take advantage of the more primitive communications that they had back in the 1970s. He didn't get approval from the State Department for everything he did. One of his key aides at the time was a woman named Susie Garment. At the time, she was Susie Weaver. And Susie Weaver was a PhD who had served with Moynihan at Harvard as a graduate student and had been his graduate assistant. And here she is in the UN, helping to write his speeches, helping with his strategy. But also, it being the 1970s, being the girl was sometimes given secretarial duties that were helpful to both her and Moynihan. So whenever Moynihan had a controversial speech that he didn't want Henry Kissinger and the State Department to see before he gave, or when he was contemplating a controversial move such as not showing up at the Idi Amin dinner, he would give the speech or a letter to Susie Garment and ask her to use this new machine they had in the office called a facsimile. And she, being the girl, would muck it up and it couldn't get through, and somehow the State Department wouldn't hear about the speech until it hit the New York Times headlines. And so Moynihan boycotts the Waldheim dinner, and he denounces Idi Amin, and that creates a controversy. And he says, what's going on here? Why are we angrier at the person who's boycotting Idi Amin than at Idi Amin, who's already killed over 300,000 people in Uganda? Where's our moral compass? Now, part of the reason why Moynihan feels lonely is because the Israelis themselves, except for Chaim Hertzog, the UN ambassador, are not taking the Zionism, racism resolution all that seriously. Partially because there was a phrase that made its round in Israel. The founding prime minister of Israel, David Ben-Gurion, had said when there was a UN resolution that he disliked, in Hebrew, the word for UN is He said, shmum. It's not important what the UN says. They're also involved, and that's why these photos are significant, in a whole different dimension. Moynihan's focusing on words counting. Moynihan's focusing on the UN being this stage for the Cold War and sees the Zionism's racism resolution as an attempt to humiliate the United States by picking on one of its key allies. Back in Jerusalem, and with Henry Kissinger in Washington, they're seeing a different dynamic. It's 1975. In 1973, of course, had been the October 1973 Yom Kippur War. Egypt had been part of the Soviet alliance, and now in the 2 years since, partially due to Henry Kissinger's shuttle diplomacy, Egypt is in the process of leaving the Soviet orbit and going into more of an American alliance. And of course, we now know that 2 years later will be Anwar Sadat's heroic trip to Jerusalem and the signing of the Egypt-Israeli peace accord in 78 and then 79. So things are happening. And both the Israeli diplomats in Jerusalem and the Washington diplomats in the State Department are more focused on that dynamic and say, let's not take the UN too seriously. But Hertzog, the Israeli ambassador, and Moynihan working together say, no, this will hurt us. This will be something that lasts. This big lie, or what Moynihan would call it, the big red lie, because to emphasize its communist origins, will stick to the Jewish state and will change discourse. and change the discourse about Israel. So on November 10th, 1975, Chaim Hertzog gets up and he notes that it's actually the anniversary of Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass, when the Nazis had gone in and broken crystal chandeliers and candelabras in synagogues across Germany. And then he says, once again, that we're not being judged, you're being judged. And that morning, he had been talking to his wife, Ora, and she said, remember what your father did? When Chaim Herzog's father, who had been the chief rabbi of Palestine in the 1930s, was protesting against the British White Paper, a British decision to limit immigration to Palestine precisely as things were getting worse in Nazi Germany and preventing many German Jews from arriving in Palestine. Herzog's father, distinguished rabbi, often went around town with big fancy hat, white tie and tails, very British, very proper, had taken that white paper and ripped it up. And Chaim Herzog, inspired by his wife, says, for us, the Jewish people, this is no more than a piece of paper and we shall treat it as such, and rips it up to show his contempt. And to this day, Herzog died many years ago, but his widow still lives just outside Tel Aviv, and apparently in her home, there's a frame with the ripped up resolution, still reminding them of that courageous man's big moment. Moynihan's very careful not to speak before the resolution is passed. He knows the resolution is going to pass. His fight against the resolution has become so passionate and so controversial that he's afraid that if he speaks before the resolution, people will say, well, the reason why the resolution passed was because of your speech. So he waits until the resolution passes, and then, using his prerogative as the American ambassador, gets up and says, the United States rises to declare before the General Assembly of the United Nations and before the world that it does not acknowledge, it will not abide by, it will never acquiesce in this infamous act echoing Franklin Roosevelt's denunciation of the Pearl Harbor sneak attack. And Moynihan goes on, and he looks at what is Zionism. And he says Zionism is Jewish nationalism. He says, to accuse one country in this forum of countries of being racist just doesn't make sense. And in fact, he said, of all nationalisms to pick, because of the peculiar relationship, the unique relationship between the Jewish people and the Jewish religion, which allows non-Jews to convert into Judaism and just become a part of the Jewish people, Zionism is in fact the most permeable form of nationalism. It's the least racist. And then he says, look at what goes on in Israel. You have many different racial types. And he's being very carefully saying there are, and I say it too, there are lots of different words you can use to criticize Israeli policy. That's not what this discussion is about. What this discussion is about is taking a particular word, a particularly harsh word, a particularly inflammatory word, a word that after the revolutions of the 1960s, the world finally agrees is abhorrent, and affixing it to one particular country simply to delegitimize it, simply to change the terms of the debate. And of course, we know that in many ways it worked. But then he goes on, having explained what Zionism is. He then says the terrible lie that's been told here today will have terrible consequences, because the United Nations will be seen as a place where lies are told. The United Nations will take the coin of the realm, human rights, and make it politicized. And we're taking that word racism and hollowing it out and stripping it of meaning. How will peoples of the world feel about racism and the need to struggle against it when they're told that it's an idea so broad as to include this Jewish national liberation movement in a form of national liberation movements? After his speech, and after the session ends, Moynihan walks out and has a press conference and is so proud of the fact that representing the United States at that moment are a black Protestant, an Irish Catholic, a Polish Jew, a Midwestern WASP, Don Fraser, who was a Midwestern congressman from Minnesota, Clarence Mitchell, who had been known as the 101st Senator for his important work with the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, lobbying Congress for all the civil rights legislation in the 1950s and 1960s, Len Garment, Jewish, and Moynihan. And then I understand they went off to the nearest Irish bar and drowned their sorrows. Part of Moynihan's moment was also the question of where are the American people and where are, as Moynihan had said to Hertzog, where are your bloody Jews? And the next day, in Midtown Manhattan, they got the answer. Despite feeling so alone, despite feeling undermined by Henry Kissinger on the day that Moynihan gave his speech, in one of the transcripts I didn't find in the Library of Congress, I found elsewhere, but I'll nevertheless quote it, says to one of his aides on telephone, he says, we're conducting foreign policy here. This isn't a synagogue. So you have the first Jewish Secretary of State undermining this Irish Catholic UN ambassador, and they have actually, he and Kissinger and his aide then joke about whether Moynihan wants to convert. Because they think he's being too ardent in his defense of Israel. He's being too passionate. He's being too confrontational. He's not being diplomatic. And so in the small world that Moynihan is living in, the New York Times, Henry Kissinger, his Harvard colleagues, the State Department colleagues who are undermining him at every step of the way, he's feeling very alone. But then the next day, over 125,000 people mass in Midtown Manhattan. And it's blacks and whites together. It's left and right together. It's Jews and Christians together. All standing up and saying, this is not acceptable. It goes from the far right, George Wallace, Ronald Reagan, Barry Goldwater denouncing it, to the far left, Cesar Chavez, Eldridge Cleaver, Black Panther, sitting in jail, writes that this is unacceptable. And at that rally, at that extraordinary Midtown rally, Moynihan does, of course, appear. It's not appropriate for him. But Bayard Rustin speaks. Bayard Rustin was Martin Luther King's key lieutenant. He was known as Mr. March because he had helped organize the March in Washington. I don't know where we are in this building, but somewhere, wherever the Lincoln Memorial is, in 1963. Rustin had been supporting Moynihan in his fight every step of the way, quoting King, trying to make it clear that if the word racism is used too broadly, in fact, Bayard Rustin says if the word racism is used to mean every SOB on the international scene, then we lose the meaning of the word, and we can't use it. They're hijacking our terms. They're hijacking our words. And Rustin says that at the rally. And then looking at this tremendous crowd, Rustin starts singing. When Israel was in Egypt's land, and 125,000 people sing, let my people go. And that too was Moynihan's moment. Moynihan's moment was a matter of Moynihan standing up with his courage and with his words and with his eloquence and with his insight. But it was also resonating with the American people saying, finally, somebody's standing up. Finally, somebody's showing a different mode of leadership. And in the letters that we have here in the Library of Congress, you see letters from all over the United States saying, attaboy, finally, somebody's helping us. Attaboy, finally, we're hearing a new sound from American leadership. And of course, popular culture joins in. So that week, there's this relatively new show back in the 1970s called NBC Saturday Night. It's not yet called Saturday Night Live. The name will change a few months later. And you may recall that Chevy Chase would do his weekly news update, a mock news update. And first he would imitate Gerald Ford, either stumbling with a telephone or that night actually he drinks a presidential glass of water and pours it in his ear. And then reporting the news as Chevy Chase would, he says, the United Nations General Assembly this week decided to declare Zionism as racism. Sammy Davis Jr., the African-American entertainer who had recently converted to Judaism, said, what a breakthrough, I can finally hate myself. And we start seeing in cartoons, no kidding, do you really think I'm as flamboyant as Pat Moynihan? He becomes a name brand. He starts setting a new standard. He becomes man of the bicentennial year, echoing that slogan from the revolution, don't tread on me. And what's more important than making the cover of Time magazine? Making the cover of People magazine as one of the 25 most intriguing people of 1975, along with Cher, Woody Allen, and Betty Ford. And then the backlash. Moynihan's becoming a pop star. Kissinger, of course, doesn't like it because this clash of Harvard ego continues. Ivor Richards, representing the United Kingdom, who, again, we should emphasize, like Kissinger, had voted against the resolution, disliked the resolution, thought it was a distraction, gets up, though, and says, this is not the OK Corral, and I'm hardly Wyatt Earp. as a way of denouncing, without of course mentioning Moynihan by name, because he's too British and polite for that, to denounce Moynihan's cowboy diplomacy. And there's a bit of backlash in the press here. We see someone whispering to Moynihan, perhaps the third world nations would be more cooperative, Mr. Moynihan, if you didn't insist on referring to the UN as the white man's burden. And here we see Henry Kissinger, as Moynihan is getting beaten up by his fellow delegates, say, do let Jerry and me know if we can be of any help. Jerry Ford. And so the inevitable happens. Within months of this great moment, within months of Moynihan's moment, Kissinger's machinations ultimately work, and Moynihan resigns. He only is UN ambassador for 8 months. His reaction, as people told him to tone down, he says, what does it mean to tone down? Do we start negotiating over a lie and say it's only half a lie? What do they think we've become? What do they think of us? They know it's not true. And we see the attack that he's being so undiplomatic. And that's why Moynihan has to leave. And finally, we see here Kissinger's delight that Moynihan is going back to Harvard, won't be bothering him again. But of course, most of the American people feel just when we needed him most, Moynihan has left us. But he wasn't going to leave the scene for very long. And due to the tremendous popular reaction, this embrace that he got when he walked into Carnegie Hall, people as one stood up and applauded him. When he walked down the streets from his hotel, the Waldorf Astoria, where the U.S. ambassador to the UN has an apartment, to the UN, cab drivers would honk and go, you show him, Pat! And probably various expletive deleted to bring another phrase back from the 1970s. And so in 1976, Moynihan jumps into the race to represent New York in the U.S. Senate. It's a very colorful race, which deserves its own book. Paul O'Dwyer, Patrick Moynihan, Abe Hirschfeld, the parking magnate in the middle who had fought for the Irgun in the 1940s, Ramsey Clark, who had been Lyndon Johnson's Attorney General, and of course Bella Abzug. And Moynihan actually only wins by a few thousand votes. That in itself is its own story. But he goes on to become U.S. Senator. For 16 years, Moynihan pushes to have the Zionism is Racism resolution repealed. It sticks in his craw. How could the UN have done this? It's not over. And people tell him, you're nuts. The UN never goes back on a resolution. The General Assembly has never repealed a resolution. In fact, they would technically not repeal it in 1991. Moreover, the UN has become the third world dictators debating society. Every year, more and more anti-Israel resolutions are being passed. How can you even imagine such a thing? And yet working in an extraordinary display of bipartisanship, first with Ronald Reagan, and then with George H.W. Bush, even while disagreeing with Reagan domestically, and even while criticizing many aspects of Reagan's foreign policy. They work on this resolution, they work and they work and they work, and finally, in December 1991, the resolution is repealed as the Soviet Union collapses. And that should be the end of the story. But alas, Moynihan was right. The big red lie, this Soviet propaganda move to humiliate the United States by tarring its ally with this racist attack, has entered into the intellectual bloodstream, entered into the national bloodstream. Here's a celebration with Hertzog and Moynihan the day the resolution was repealed. And so 10 years later even, you see in Durban in South Africa, in a conference against racism, the focus ends up being not on how do we get reparations and try to fix all the ugly racist acts that have occurred, but the focus becomes on calling Zionism racism once again. And it continues in weeks on college campuses accusing Israel of the crime of apartheid, which blurs the truth. Because again, whatever criticism one may have of Israel, the apartheid regime was based on color. And Israel's fight with the Palestinians is a national conflict, not a racial conflict. It's not about color. I want to end, because I'm sure you want me to too, with a few brief conclusions. First, and here we see Daniel Patrick Moynihan and Henry Jackson, two senators fighting for American ideals and standing up for Israel. We see the deep, enduring U.S.-Israel ties. We see that the U.S.-Israel relationship is not AstroTurf, an artificial thing manipulated by lobbyists, pushed by money. But it's about common ideals. That moment in November 1975 is an extraordinary moment in American history and in Jewish history. When really for the first time in history, a superpower stands up and looks at an act, and most people use the term anti-Semitic and call it anti-Semitic, and people from the churches from left and right, as I've said, black and white, stand up and say it's unacceptable. And again, there'll be room for disagreements about borders and boundaries and policies, but the core relationship is what this discussion is about. Second, we see that the move to delegitimize Israel, not to debate what it does, but to attack its very essence, its very right to exist, is a key Moynihan term, totalitarian. And he fought totalitarianism because to him the notion of a totalitarian ideal was to sacrifice everything in the service of that ideal. He saw it happen in the Soviet Union. He saw it happen when he served in the Navy in World War II. He saw it happening in China. And he saw it happening here in the attack on Israel. Moreover, we see that in 1991, the resolution is repealed. We then have the Madrid Conference, which opens up dialogue between Israel and many of the Arab nations. And then we have the Oslo peace process. And whatever you think about the Oslo peace process, the fact that the Oslo peace process comes after the Zionism as racism resolution is repealed, to me, is significant. It shows that anyone who wants to see some sort of peaceful resolution, anyone who wants to see progress in the Middle East, has to start by lowering the rhetorical temperature, by stopping to use inflammatory terms and accusations like racism. How can you expect Palestinians to make peace with an entity they deem racist? How do you expect Israelis to make peace when they're in a defensive crouch because they're accused of being racist, and like South Africa? And in fact, what occurred, and I'm quoting here the works of the great historian Winthrop Jordan, was there was a process of debasement. The language, Zionism and racism, Israel apartheid, creates a we and a they, and it makes it very difficult to advance. And what Moynihan predicted was, he said, Israel will be regretted. It's what I call the equivalent of secondhand smoke. That even people who don't know the ins and outs of the conflict, when they see so much anger against one particular country, assume it must be guilty of something. And it changes the discussion in the universities. It changes the discussion in Europe. Fortunately for most Americans, it hasn't yet. We also see, of course, and this is so ironic, this is a picture from the crucial moment that I skipped over in my presentation, August 1975, the Helsinki Accords, which become critical in the establishment of a human rights regime and the power of human rights as an idea in the fight against the Soviet Union and broader in the idea for international justice. Precisely at that moment when Helsinki is showing the power of human rights, in November 1975, we see human rights politicized. The coin of the realm demeaned. We see the draining of the word racism from its meaning. And he says the damage we do, I'm in the middle there, to the idea of human rights and the language of human rights could well be irreversible. If we destroy the words that were given to us by past centuries, we will not have words to replace them. For philosophy today has no such words. But there are those of us, he says, who have not forsaken these older words, still so new to much of the world. Not forsaken them, not here, not now, not anywhere, not ever. That's in his famous November 10th speech. We see a new mode of politics on the international scene which is required. The United States has to understand, as Moynihan said in his commentary article, the U.S. is in opposition. It's outvoted in the UN. There's a different dynamic. Liberalism itself is undergoing tensions. And he's fighting for liberalism against the totalitarian left. And the fight between Kissinger and Moynihan, which itself could be not just a great book and movie, but also a whole, not just a great movie and play, but a great book, is about the constant fight we still see between a foreign policy that's based on realism and a foreign policy that's based on idealism. How much of it is our interests and how much of it is our conscience? And in his recent second inaugural address, Barack Obama talked about a foreign policy based on both those ideas, conscience and values, but they often are in tension. And there's a deeper thing here. Moynihan, and you see in the small writing here, what do you call a 6'5" angry Irishman? Sir. And Moynihan says, many believe our assailant our assailants are motivated by what's wrong about us, they are wrong. They're assailed because of what is right about us. We are assailed because we are a democracy. And in later years, he would talk about Moynihan's law, the notion that the more newspaper articles that emerge condemning a country's human rights record is a reflection of how good its human rights record is, because you have a free press. And two last ones. One is we have what I call the politics of patriotic indignation. Moynihan's power, Moynihan's passion inspires the 1976 movie Network, where Peter Finch gets up and says, "I'm mad as hell, I'm not going to take it anymore." It inspires Ronald Reagan, who quotes Moynihan in his speeches in his 1976 campaign against Gerald Ford, and ultimately turns it into a more positive vein with Morning in America. And it's part of a broad series of moments in American history. Patrick Henry, "Give me liberty, give me death." Andrew Jackson, his famous toast against John C. Calhoun, "Our union, it must be preserved." Sojourner Truth saying, "I ain't I a woman." Joseph Welch standing up against Senator McCarthy and saying, "Have you no sense of decency left? Have you no sense of decency?" And finally, Moynihan's message: individuals count. Words matter. He said in his journey, he learned that you have to stand for something. You have to stand for core ideals. He learned, and this is his final public appearance at Harvard commencement shortly before he died. He died 10 years ago on March 26, 2003. He said, civilization need not die. This is after 9/11. At this moment, only the United States can save it. As we fight the war against evil, he wanted to be clear in his witness against evil, but also keep with the generosity. We must also wage peace, guided by the lesson of the Marshall Plan. And finally, what he said to Henry Kissinger in one of his telegrams during that titanic battle between the two of them: "I hope people will remember that an issue of honor, of morality was put before us, and not all of us ran." That's what Moynihan stood for. That's what Moynihan's moment is all about. It's about Daniel Patrick Moynihan standing for honor and morality, and about the American people standing and rising and applauding him for doing that. Thank you very much.
We have time for some questions.
Yes.
First of all, I want to thank you, Gil, for writing this extraordinary book. It reads like a novel, and the characters are so vividly presented. And I thought my dad's finest hour. And I want to ask what I asked you last week from the Harvard Club in this book, to tell us about the distinguished career of Kurt Waldheim, who was Secretary General then, and was later, it was revealed, was a Nazi. And why was his career as a Nazi concealed, and how was it then brought out because of Moynihan's law?
Thank you for that. Our best understanding is that at the time the KGB, the Soviet secret police, was well aware of Waldheim's Nazi past and was probably blackmailing him and keeping Waldheim in line. And the way the story of Waldheim's Nazi past emerged, it came to light, is a complicated story about journalists using investigative tools, very similar to the thing that researchers use every day in this extraordinary place, looking at old records, comparing Waldheim's descriptions of what he said he was doing in the 1940s with other records during the war, and also things, for example, he said he wasn't involved in many military actions because he hurt his foot, and yet he emerged as a champion skier shortly after the war. And a series of journalists putting together a series of anomalies started realizing that the story that Kurt Waldheim was telling wasn't true. And when he ran for president of Austria, it all came to light. And Moynihan's instinct that you saw in that extraordinary picture you gave to me indeed turned out to be true. And Kurt Waldheim was revealed to the world as a Nazi, and indeed we now understand was probably being blackmailed. And that's part of there's an uglier underside to the UN story. It's a story of bribery. I found evidence of delegates who could be bought for a song. And partially, look, New York, even in the 1970s, is an expensive place. Many of these delegates coming from much poorer countries don't have very generous living allowances. And the Libyans in particular, the Saudi Arabians, the Soviets were very happy to supplement incomes. They were happy to use prostitutes for bribery and for blackmail. There's a whole ugly underside to this, but I wanted to keep this discussion, despite my opening expletive, on a higher level. Other questions, comments, disagreements? Yes?
I understood that Moynihan felt that the Soviet Union was beyond are you aware of any decrease in the anti-Israel sentiment since the break-up of the Soviet Union?
Oh, thank you for that. It's an excellent question. In the book ultimately focuses on this Moynihan's moment of November 10th, 1975. Chapter 8 ends up being about the speech, but inevitably I tell the story after that. And two things happen. On the one hand, when the Soviet Union falls, and part of the Soviet Union's motivation for pushing this resolution was not just because it's trying to humiliate the United States, not just because it's playing the Cold War Act, but it's also seeing that there are 3 million Soviet Jews who are increasingly asking to leave the Soviet Union, to emigrate to Israel. And by having the UN call Zionism racism, someone like Anatoly Sharansky, now Natan Sharansky, could be accused in his trial of being a racist because he said he was a Zionist. So the propaganda move is very helpful to the Soviet Union. And what's extraordinary, and you see this in Robert Wistritt's extraordinary book, a big, thick, 700-page tome, The Lethal Obsession, about the history of anti-Semitism. He goes into detail about how the Soviet Union all but matched the Nazi Germany in its output of propaganda against the Jewish people and against the state of Israel. And he says that this obsession with Jews is extraordinary, and he can't think of another example of so much effort being put from propagandistic perspective. So on the one hand, when the Soviet Union collapses, and at that moment in 1991, the Soviet Union itself, in one of its last votes in the UN, its ambassador votes to have the resolution repealed. So there seems to be at that moment a kind of window of opportunity and hopes for change. But as I suggested with the Durban slide and the short mention of Durban, that even though the Soviet Union is no longer a major player in the push to delegitimize Israel, others take on the torch. And we see it in the Arab countries. We see it in parts, and I want to be very clear in my language here, in parts of the Palestinian national movement, not all of it. We see it spreading in this totalitarian left that Moynihan was fighting. So the Soviet Union made its mark. And this is actually one of the great ironies, that even though it collapsed, even though the resolution was repealed, this huge infrastructure that it created and this big red lie continues. Good. Well, I want to thank you. And if I just may take a moment on a personal note, I want to acknowledge the presence of my parents, Elaine and Bernard Troy, and my brothers, Dan and Chevy Troy. It's not easy being the parents of a historian. You have to, and it's really not easy. My wife isn't here, but it's really not easy being the wife of a historian. She says she's married to a perpetual graduate student. It's many late nights. It's a lot of lack of clarity in your career. It's a lot of moments where you're not sure what's going to happen. And the support that I've received from my family has been incredibly important to me. And I just want to thank them publicly. And I want to thank all of you for being a part of this conversation. And I see some of the librarians who I worked with way back in the 1980s here, so I want to welcome you and thank the Books and Beyond series again for including me in this extraordinary series in this extraordinary place. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.